Imagine a world where millions upon millions of folks just died. From stuff we now think of as a minor inconvenience, think about that. A simple cut could turn deadly. A bug going around could wipe out entire towns like poof, gone. And hey, this wasn't some ancient, far-off time. For most of history, that was just life. But what if I told you some of the biggest wins in medicine are practically invisible? That the stories we do hear, the famous faces we put on pedestals, they really only show us a sliver of what truly went down. Monumental human achievements right there, hiding in plain sight. So I'm your host, and for ages now I've been poking around in the dusty, forgotten corners of science history. This is the stuff the news crews totally missed. Now, buckle up. Over the next, say, 29 minutes, we're gonna unearth 3 cures that were absolutely game changers. Stuff so huge it completely changed how healthy people were globally. And yeah, it made us live way longer. Thing is, the geniuses behind them and sometimes the discoveries themselves just kinda faded away from public memory. Nobody remembers them. And we're not talking about small potatoes here. We're talking about breakthroughs that totally rewrote the rulebook on how long we live and how healthy entire countries became. So why aren't their names household words? Why do their stories just vanish while other folks, maybe doing less impactful stuff, are practically etched into our brains forever? Pseudonym disclaimer start. All right, real quick, a heads up about the folks we're gonna talk about. You know, when people are trying to figure stuff out, it's usually a team effort. And sometimes the most important work comes from people who are happy just staying out of the spotlight. So to keep things clear and to protect folks' privacy when needed, we might use fake names for some individuals. But don't worry, all the facts, all the science stuff, that's all gonna be straight from the historical records we've got. Pseudonym disclaimer end. The way we usually hear about modern medicine is like a highlight reel of famous scientists and their sudden aha moments. We all know Fleming and penicillin, right? And Salk with polio. And those stories are super important, don't get me wrong. But man, they're almost never the whole picture. The real deal is way more complicated, like this giant quilt stitched together with tons of dedication, a lot of which nobody ever claps for. Take penicillin, for instance. The story of Alexander Fleming stumbling upon that mold's germ-killing power back in 1928? That's legendary. But the mold itself didn't magically save millions. Nah, it was the incredibly tough, super detailed grind of turning that discovery into a drug people could actually use, and make a lot of, that really flipped the script. Howard Florey and Ernst Chain, leading a crew at Oxford, they hit wall after wall. During World War II, Britain was flat broke, couldn't possibly make enough penicillin. So they had to sneak their precious mold cultures over to the United States, dealing with all the wartime secrecy and crazy logistics. Just picturing the sheer amount of work to clean, stabilize, and produce penicillin on a scale that could handle a global war is mind-blowing. This wasn't one little eureka moment. This was a solid decade of just non-stop scientific and engineering hustle. Yet, when people tell the story, Fleming usually gets all the glory. Florey and Chain, the guys who actually made penicillin a life-saving reality, they often end up just being a quick mention, a footnote. Their part in getting it made in massive amounts, which directly allowed the drug to save countless lives on the battlefield and in hospitals, that part just doesn't get the spotlight it deserves. Source: NCBI. And this pattern, it just keeps showing up all over medical history. The groundwork, the often messy, unglamorous steps that make a big breakthrough possible, they frequently get totally overshadowed by the flashy, headline-grabbing end result. Think about the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk's name is basically the name when you talk about getting rid of that terrifying disease. His killed virus polio vaccine, announced in '55, brought this massive wave of hope and relief to a world absolutely paralyzed by fear. But Salk wasn't working in a vacuum, you know. His incredible achievement was built on the shoulders of essential, but often totally uncredited, work done by earlier scientists. John Enders, Thomas Weller, and Frederick Robbins hit a critical point years before Salk even got started. They were the absolute first to actually grow the polio virus in a lab. This wasn't some small step, folks. For decades, scientists were pulling their hair out trying to grow the virus outside of a living person or animal. You had to be able to do that to even think about making and testing a vaccine. Their knack for growing poliovirus in non-nerve cell cultures, work that actually scored them the Nobel Prize in 1954, that was the absolute foundation. Everything that came after, including Salk's work, was built on that bedrock. Source: CDC. Enders, Weller, and Robbins basically handed over the essential tool. Without them being able to consistently make and study the virus in a dish, Salk's massive job would have been a million times harder, maybe even impossible. Yet in the popular story, their names, they hardly ever pop up. The spotlight stays locked on the vaccine itself, on Salk's direct victory and the crucial science that made it all happen. Yeah, that just gets forgotten. It's a weird paradox. The more successful a medical thing becomes, the simpler its origins can seem, like it was just inevitable. And those crucial early steps, they just become invisible. Our collective memory of how science moves forward is a really strange beast. It seems to love the dramatic tale, the lone genius, the outcome that's super easy to grasp. The years of painstaking research, the failures, the group efforts, the vital but unsexy steps, those are the bits that tend to just drift away. And it's not just about remembering specific scientists either. Sometimes the very way a cure works gets kind of fuzzy. We tend to picture cures as one single thing, like a pill or a shot. But a lot of the most impactful treatments are way more complicated, needing us to really get how molecules are put together and how biological stuff happens. Look at Dorothy Hodgkin. A total trailblazer in chemistry, she used this fancy technique called X-ray crystallography to figure out the exact 3D shapes of complicated molecules. Her work was absolutely essential for understanding how certain super important substances did their jobs. She figured out the structure of penicillin, which gave massive clues that helped in making it and producing it on a huge scale. Even crazier, she cracked the structure of vitamin B12. That discovery was vital for understanding a disease called pernicious anemia and figuring out how to treat it effectively. Hodgkin's incredibly detailed, painstaking work, often done when resources were tough, laid the groundwork for tons of medical applications. Her Nobel Prize in Chemistry back in 1964 totally acknowledged how important her structural analyses were. But still, her name isn't as famous as the drugs whose inner workings she helped unlock. Her fundamental contributions to understanding these life-saving molecules often get lost behind the direct treatments themselves. Source: Nobel Prize Archive. The science behind the cure, the intricate mapping of atoms and the bonds between them, that's a whole different universe from the patient getting the treatment. And somewhere in that distance, understanding can just vanish. Now, this isn't about downplaying the amazing work of the people who brought treatments directly to patients. Not at all. It's about giving credit where it's due for the entire chain of discovery. It's about recognizing that a cure is rarely just one shining star, but more like a whole galaxy of efforts, a long and often super twisty road. And the stakes here are massive, folks. We're not just talking about some dusty academic debates. We are talking about interventions that have saved millions of lives, stopped unimaginable suffering, and fundamentally changed the course of human health. These are the quiet giants upon whose broad shoulders modern medicine stands tall. Consider the battle against diseases caused by tiny parasites. For centuries, these illnesses have wrecked huge populations, causing crippling sickness, blindness, and people dying way too young, especially in hot, humid parts of the world. Think about diseases like onchocerciasis, which causes river blindness, and lymphatic filariasis, which leads to swollen limbs and disability, known as elephantiasis. These have messed with hundreds of millions of people. The creation of ivermectin is a perfect example of a cure that was absolutely revolutionary. While the medical world knows about it, most regular folks have never heard of it. Its discovery by Satoshi Omura and William C. Campbell, which came out of their research into soil microbes, led to a drug that has completely transformed how we treat these devastating parasitic infections. Ivermectin, which comes from a type of bacteria found in the soil in Japan, turned out to be amazingly effective and safe against a whole bunch of parasitic worms. Its impact has been nothing short of world-changing, especially through these huge programs that distribute it widely to fight onchocerciasis and lymphatic filariasis. These programs have massively cut down how common these diseases are, stopping millions from going blind and becoming disabled, and making life way better for countless others. Omura and Campbell got the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015 for their discovery. But the name, ivermectin itself, while maybe sounding familiar to some people for other reasons lately, isn't really connected in the public mind with its incredible role in controlling some of the world's most neglected tropical diseases. The sheer number of lives improved, suffering eased, and blindness prevented by this one drug is genuinely hard to even describe. The World Health Organization totally recognizes how big a problem diseases like schistosomiasis, onchocerciasis, and lymphatic filariasis are globally. They've all seen a massive impact from the development of antiparasitic drugs. Source: WHO. While the public might hear about global health efforts in general, the specific drugs and the scientists behind them often stay hidden, even when those drugs are literally saving millions from debilitating conditions. So why this disconnect? Is it the nature of the disease itself, affecting people in areas that don't get as much news coverage? Is it the slow, ongoing nature of the treatment, rather than some dramatic, one-time cure? Or is it just the way history gets written down, favoring stories that are easy to digest? The fallout from this collective forgetting is pretty serious. When we forget the full story of how medicine advanced, we risk not appreciating the scientific process itself enough. We might not grasp the sheer complexity and the immense human effort involved. And we could fail to see how crucial it still is to support basic research and all that often invisible work that our most critical medical breakthroughs rely on. Today, we're gonna bring these stories back out into the open. We're gonna look at the hidden cures, the heroes nobody talks about, and the critical scientific ideas that have saved millions and are still shaping our future. These aren't just tiny footnotes in history books. They are the absolute foundation of modern public health, and their stories absolutely deserve to be heard. We'll dive deep into the science, the struggles, and the profound impact of three of these truly revolutionary breakthroughs. Get ready to see medical history not as a lineup of famous names, but as this massive, interconnected web of discovery, where real heroism is often found in the quiet, steady, relentless pursuit of knowledge. Look, the history of medicine, it's like this incredibly complex tapestry, right? You've got these threads of amazing, brilliant ideas, but then, man, there are also these threads of just devastating tragedy woven right in. We all cheer for the big breakthroughs, the ones that totally changed how we deal with health, the names you see plastered all over textbooks and, echoing down hospital corridors. But honestly, underneath all those famous wins, there are so many other victories, these quiet revolutions that probably saved millions of lives, but they just kind of faded away out of public memory. Those are the hidden cures we're talking about here. Okay, so picture this. A world where a tiny little scratch, something you wouldn't even think twice about today, could actually turn into a death sentence. Yeah, before the late 1800s, tetanus, which they called lockjaw back then, was this super scary monster, especially for soldiers getting hurt in wars or for women giving birth. The way it twisted your muscles, that agonizing, slow grip of death, it was just a common, awful horror nobody could escape. Then, it was like a new day started dawning in labs all over Europe and Japan. In the middle of this explosion of a new field called bacteriology, scientists were actually starting to figure out the tiny, microscopic reasons why people got sick. We're talking about guys like Emil von Behring in Germany and Kitasato Shibasaburo in Japan. They were working kinda separately, but also sometimes together, and they were right on the edge of discovering something huge. Their work was laser-focused on diphtheria and tetanus, two nasty infections caused by bacteria. What they figured out was pretty wild. If you injected animals with either weakened or totally inactive toxins made by these bacteria, the animals would actually build up a kind of immunity. And here's the kicker: the blood serum from those protected animals. It had these things called antitoxins in it. Super potent substances that could actually fight off and neutralize the real disease toxins. Pretty neat, huh? And that, my friends, was the moment the antitoxic serum was born. This whole idea, it was going to completely flip medicine on its head. See, the serum acted like a passive immunization. It wasn't a vaccine that teaches your body how to fight. Nope, this was like getting a direct shot of antibodies, ready to go, already equipped to battle those nasty toxins. Pretty wild concept for the time. The effect was immediate, like bam, instant and massive. For soldiers with battlefield wounds, this antitoxin was like a shield against tetanus that would try to fester in those injuries. And for new moms and their babies, It drastically slashed the death rates from puerperal fever, which was basically a form of tetanus that haunted maternity wards. This wasn't just a small improvement. It was a total game changer, a dramatic shift against diseases that had been killing people for centuries. So you gotta ask yourself, why is this absolutely groundbreaking achievement often just, tucked away in the footnotes of medical history? Well, the late 19th century was this crazy, golden age of bacteriology. Discoveries were just popping up left and right, like fireworks. Louis Pasteur was already a superstar for his work on rabies and anthrax, and Robert Koch was busy identifying the exact germs that caused tuberculosis and cholera. It was a busy time. The antitoxin, while totally revolutionary, maybe wasn't as visually dramatic or as outwardly heroic as, say, developing a vaccine that someone gets once and is protected for life. It was a treatment, a serum taken from another animal. It was a technique that, even though it saved lives, perhaps just didn't have the same kind of public-facing pizzazz as some of those other vaccines. Now, Emil von Behring. He actually got the very first Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine back in 1901 for his work on diphtheria serum. That definitely shows how important it was. But here's the thing. Even a Nobel Prize doesn't always mean the general public fully grasps or constantly remembers the serum itself. The technique and the whole concept of antitoxins got acknowledged, sure. But that specific application for tetanus and how it was quietly, persistently saving lives, it often just got overshadowed by those flashier vaccines that came later. The science world was just buzzing with all these new possibilities back then. The antitoxin was a super important step, no doubt, but it was just one piece of the puzzle among so many incredible advancements. In the big, grand story of medical progress, the antitoxin for tetanus, even with its massive impact, ended up being this crucial but often unsung hero. All right, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another silent killer, one that really targeted the most vulnerable, moms and their brand new babies. Before the mid-1800s, childbirth, this totally natural event, was often this absolutely terrifying ordeal. This awful thing called childbed fever, or puerperal fever, was just hanging around, a constant threat. This super nasty infection, which came with high fevers, chills, and often led to a swift death, would just rip through maternity wards. It was this grim reality that for so many women, the pure joy of bringing new life into the world was tragically cut short by sepsis. For centuries, the reason why? It was a total mystery, just shrouded in fear and this feeling of complete helplessness. Then, way back in the 1840s, this Hungarian doctor named Ignaz Semmelweis, who was working in Vienna, started noticing something really stark and frankly disturbing. He saw that women giving birth in the first maternity clinic, the one where medical students also did autopsies, had way higher rates of puerperal fever compared to the women in the second clinic, which was mainly staffed by midwives. Semmelweis, being the super careful observer that he was really bothered by this. He came up with this idea, a pretty radical one at the time, since germ theory wasn't really a thing yet, that maybe cadaverous particles, like little bits left over from the autopsy room, were being carried on the doctor's hands to the mothers during their exams. Crazy thought, right? His suggested fix. It was actually pretty simple but totally revolutionary. Wash your hands. He basically ordered that medical students and doctors had to wash their hands really well with a chlorinated lime solution before they examined any patients. And the results? They were nothing short of miraculous. Seriously, the number of puerperal fever cases in his clinic just plummeted. The death rate dropped like a stone, going from something absolutely staggering down to practically zero. Semmelweis, in effect, had stumbled upon antiseptic procedures years before Joseph Lister even came along and before germ theory was widely accepted. He found a way to stop infections just by cleaning hands. But even with this overwhelming proof staring them in the face, Semmelweis's findings were met with pushback, even outright hostility, from the established medical community. His ideas basically challenged everything they believed, and yikes, they implied that the doctors themselves were the ones spreading the disease. They just couldn't wrap their heads around his insistence on hand-washing, something that seemed so basic, almost insulting to them. His desperate pleas for better hand hygiene were mostly ignored. And tragically, Semmelweis himself eventually died from an infection, likely from an injury he got during an autopsy. He ended up dying in an asylum after being committed by his own colleagues. just heartbreaking. The real importance of Semmelweis's work, this fundamental idea that clean hands act as a barrier against infection, wouldn't actually be fully understood for decades, not until germ theory finally took hold. His discovery, a life-saving intervention that could have prevented so much suffering and death, was basically suppressed by a mix of stubborn scientific traditions, professional egos, and just a plain lack of understanding. It's a really stark, sobering reminder that sometimes, the most powerful cures are also the simplest ones. And that getting people to accept something new, especially when it goes against what everyone already believes, can be the toughest fight of all. Semmelweis's method, which is now a total cornerstone of healthcare all over the world, stands as this silent testament to his vision, and sadly, a tragic example of a cure that took way too long to get recognized. So you take these two discoveries, the antitoxin serum and the whole concept of washing hands to prevent infection. They represent these absolutely massive shifts in our ability to actually fight disease. They took medicine from being this field where doctors often just passively observed or offered comfort, to one where they could actively intervene and prevent illness. And yet, their widespread recognition has been weirdly quiet, kind of overshadowed by later medical marvels that were maybe just easier to sell to the public. They really stand out as powerful examples of how scientific progress isn't always this straight shot to public fame. Sometimes, the innovations that end up having the biggest impact are the ones that force us to change how we think about established ideas, the ones that require us to see something totally mundane as revolutionary. And they demand this deep, unwavering trust in the evidence, even when it's not the popular opinion. These are the hidden cures, the ones that really laid the groundwork for the world we live in today. All right, let's take this section and give it a bit of a human touch, you know. Make it sound less like a textbook and more like, well, us talking. Every word, every marker, every citation stays, just with a different flavor. Here we go. You know, the sheer devastation childhood diarrhea causes in developing nations. It's like a silent epidemic, isn't it? Just picture this, a world where a really simple infection can, like, steal a kid's life. Not with some big, dramatic, visible sickness, but just a quiet, slow draining away. That was, and honestly in so many places still is, the harsh truth for millions and millions of people. But what if the fix wasn't some complicated prescription drug, or a shiny, high-tech medical gadget, or even some groundbreaking vaccine? What if it was something so incredibly basic, so darn easy to get your hands on, that it felt almost too simple to even be called a real cure, like we usually picture them? We're talking about something called oral rehydration therapy, or ORT. For ages, the #1 killer of kids under 5 worldwide was these diarrheal diseases. These sicknesses, usually from yucky contaminated water and food, they just drain the body of fluids super fast. And kids, with their tiny bodies, they just can't handle it. Their energy just vanishes, their important organs start to give out, and sadly, a lot of them just don't make it. Before ORT came along, the main medical move was giving folks IV fluids. But that needs sterile environments, people who know what they're doing with medical stuff and expensive gear, resources that were often super hard to find, or just plain missing in those remote villages and poor communities that were hit the hardest by diarrhea. The other option? Well, it was often just waiting. Waiting for the body to fight back on its own, or just waiting for the worst to happen. Now the sheer brilliance of ORT is its beautiful, elegant simplicity. It's literally just a mix of water, sugar, and salts, specifically sodium chloride and potassium chloride, plus some sodium citrate thrown in to kind of balance it all out. This perfectly measured blend, when you drink it, it actually gets absorbed by your intestines. The sugar helps the sodium get in, and then the sodium in turn helps pull water along with it. Basically, it just puts back all the fluids and electrolytes your body lost, hitting dehydration right on the head, which is the deadly part of diarrhea. The effect? It was nothing short of amazing. Studies and just, real-world use showed that ORT could stop or treat dehydration in, like, up to 90% of cases. This wasn't some tiny, slow improvement. It was a massive drop in how many people were dying. By the late 1900s, ORT was estimated to be saving millions of kids' lives every single year. Some reports even say it saved more lives than any other medical intervention in the latter half of the 20th century, and that includes a lot of vaccines. And those vaccines are super important, mind you, but they often need complicated cold storage and multiple shots. Source: National Institutes of Health, various public health reports. So if Ort is this darn effective, why isn't it a name everyone knows like penicillin or the polio vaccine? Why is it kinda seen as this hidden cure? The answer, and it's frustratingly simple, really just goes back to the core of why it works so well. It's cheap and you can't patent it. There's just no big profit to be made for those huge pharmaceutical companies from a bit of sugar and salt. The stuff you need is available everywhere, and you can whip it up at home, or buy it in these super cheap little packets. It makes it a fantastic tool for public health efforts, sure, but it's a tough sell in the current global healthcare market where profit is king. Plus, its effectiveness is almost too straightforward, you know. In a world that's often totally wowed by these big, dramatic scientific breakthroughs, the complicated molecule stuff, the fancy lab experiments, the heroic researchers, the story of Ort, as impactful as it is, just doesn't have that perceived wow factor. It's a win for basic biology and accessible public health, not really a showcase for cutting-edge biotech. And this brings us to something really important and maybe a bit unsettling. We've now run into several ways to save lives, from the groundwork that made vaccines possible, to finding antibiotics, to developing treatments for nasty parasitic diseases, and now Ort. Each one, in its own way, has been a bright spot of hope. Yet each one, to varying degrees, has ended up kinda forgotten or overshadowed by discoveries that were either more profitable or just made for a better story. The common link? No huge, immediate profit potential. Penicillin, while a game changer, needed massive industrial scaling and development, which eventually became very profitable. Source: Nobel Prize Official Archive. But the initial, life-saving uses and the ongoing, accessible treatments for tons of neglected tropical diseases, like the ones ivermectin tackles, they often struggle for funding and attention compared to illnesses that affect people in wealthier countries. Source: World Health Organization. You start to see the pattern. Innovations that are cheap, hard to patent, or mainly help folks who can't really afford to pay much, they tend to just fade away from public awareness. They become the quiet, hard-working heroes of global health, absolutely essential, but never really getting the spotlight. The hidden aspect isn't some secret plot. It's more like the natural outcome of an economic system that's all about profit and a media world that loves a dramatic, often complicated narrative. The real structure that's hiding these cures isn't some shady group. It's the very way our global healthcare and economic systems are set up. It's a system that, by its very design, makes high-profit ventures really visible while letting these low-cost, high-impact solutions just sort of drift into the background. These aren't failures of science itself, but maybe, just maybe, a commentary on the systems we've built around it. The whole story of Ort and these other hidden cures, it's a really powerful reminder. It really hammers home that sometimes the most incredible solutions are the simplest ones. They're the ones that empower communities, that everyone can actually get, and that don't need some complicated chemical formula, but just a basic understanding of how our bodies work and a real commitment to health for everyone. Now, this isn't to say we shouldn't value complex medical research or amazing new drugs. Those are absolutely crucial, but we also really need to recognize and cheer for the power of the simple stuff, the stuff that's easy to access, and the things that often get overlooked. Because when we shine a light on these hidden cures, we're not just honoring the smart people who came up with them, but we're also getting a much clearer picture of what really saves lives on a global scale. In the next section, we're gonna dig into what this pattern actually means and what it tells us about the future of global health. Intro music fades. You know, when you look back at stuff like getting penicillin made on a massive scale, or those folks who quietly chipped away at the polio vaccine, it really hits you. Real breakthroughs. They don't always come with a big ticker tape parade. We tend to remember the flash-in-the-pan discovery, right? But honestly, it's the gritty, unglamorous grind of making something better, making it available to everyone. That's where millions truly get helped. Chuckles, it's simple to recall Fleming and his lucky Petri dish, sure. But the sheer grit of Florian Chain, taking a cool lab experiment and turning it into an antibiotic that saved so many lives on a scale we'd never seen before, that's the real story. Source: PMC. And then there's the polio vaccine. Jonas Salk, obviously, we all know the name, but his big leap forward? It was only possible because other scientists figured out how to actually grow the virus in a lab first. That critical piece, the groundwork, it's usually just a blip, a footnote in the history books. Source, CDC. These aren't just dusty old facts, though. They're huge lessons for us. What they're really telling us is that those moments we all celebrate, they're usually just the grand finale after tons of hard work, work that nobody ever sees. They really underscore how incredibly important public health efforts are, and the brilliant minds behind them, especially when their work isn't promising a quick fortune or a flashy headline. So this leads us to a big question for right now. How many other cures are out there just waiting in the wings? How many are just waiting for someone to notice them, or maybe they're being ignored because they don't fit the typical blockbuster drug or dazzling breakthrough narrative? We've got to build a world that truly values that painstaking research, those public health wins, even when they're not the most exciting news. Take Dorothy Hodgkin, for example. She used X-ray crystallography to figure out the exact structures of penicillin and vitamin B12. Super important stuff. Understanding how those molecules worked let us make better versions and use them more effectively. But her complex structural work, it often gets overshadowed by the direct, visible impact of the drugs themselves. Source, Nobel Prize. It's kind of the same with ivermectin for treating parasitic diseases. It was a game changer, absolutely, but it really speaks to that scientific persistence that ends up helping huge numbers of people. Source, WHO. These kinds of stories, they really push us to look past the obvious, to really appreciate just how much progress has been made in medicine, in all its different forms. They're practically begging us to support research and public health systems, because honestly, the next big life-saving discovery, it might not arrive with fireworks, but with quiet determination and a whole lot of persistent scientific digging. So here's the deal. Which of these stories that don't get enough attention surprised you the most? Do you know about any other cures that have been forgotten or medical heroes who deserve more recognition? Drop your thoughts down in the comments. I'd love to hear them. And hey, if you found this deep dive interesting, do us a favor and share this video. Let's shine a light on these hidden histories and help everyone appreciate the progress that really makes a difference in millions of lives. Outro music begins.